Hey everybody, here we go with the notes for Chapter 4, talking about radio today, looking a lot at how radio is kind of put together on a company level, also looking at some of the formats on radio and how those things kind of work out from a business perspective and a listening perspective. First off, I want to talk about the 3 C's of radio today. The first one that we're going to talk about is competition. As of 2010, radio as a whole gets about 8% of total advertising revenues. Now, in the grand scheme of things, as far as the total advertising budget that companies would spend, 8% is not a significant piece of the pie. So you've got thousands of radio stations across the United States, all of them competing for just that little sliver of the advertising money that is available out there that companies are willing to spend, totally forgetting about the other 92% that's spent on other forms of media. So it is very competitive between radio stations trying to get that small piece. Competitive with the other media as well, but you can see what the challenge is for radio salespeople. So out of these 14,500 radio stations in the United States, 33% of them are commercial AM stations, 45% of them are commercial FM stations. The other 22% make up non-commercial FM stations. And the non-commercials, for the most part, are going to be in that area between 88 and 92 on the FM dial, although non-commercial FM stations can be anywhere on the FM dial. Radio today is largely a locally based medium, meaning that the radio station primarily is focused on the community of license and serving the public interest in that local community. Although we do see more radio stations now kind of taking a feed that is meant to be broadcast to a national audience, still by and large, there's going to be some aspect of localism that is happening on the radio stations that you listen to. 82% of all radio listening is to FM radio stations, so that's about 4 out of every 5 listeners are listening to FM. Some people don't even know what the AM dial is anymore. AM tends to skew older. The median age of the AM listener is 57 years old. And commercial radio is a business where stations compete for a comparatively small percentage of national advertising expenditures. And we've talked a little bit about that already, but more so, it's an even tight competitive market when you're talking about national advertising dollars as opposed to local advertising dollars. Radio does tend to give local companies a better chance of advertising because of affordability and things like that. But to get those national advertising dollars, that is a hugely competitive market. All right, let's talk about the second C of radio today, which is consolidation. For nearly half of a century, radio was generally a small business. It was owned by mom and pop and your local community, and the owners were a fabric of the community. But then led by the National Association of Broadcasters, or the NAB, throughout the 1990s, the radio business successfully lobbied Congress for regulatory relief. So what sort of regulatory relief were they looking for? Well, here's one of the main things that the NAB was saying on behalf of radio businesses. Radio had become so competitive with so many stations competing for such a small advertising segment. So if we're only looking at 8% of the entire advertising pie, all these different companies clamoring for those dollars made it so that radio, in the argument of the NAB, was not a profitable or viable business under the current restrictions of ownership limits and things like that. So then the Telecommunications Act of 1996 changed the rules of radio ownership. A radio group could now own up to 8 radio stations in a large market. No national limit on the number of stations that a company could own. And this paved the way for consolidation of these different radio stations into these large radio groups. So now you have the radio supergroup, radio's largest companies, which control most radio listening and receive most radio revenue. Some of the big companies out there, including Entercom, which has large clusters all over the United States, including in the Greensboro market, Beasley Corporation, which owns stations in Fayetteville, and one of the largest ones out there, iHeartMedia, which owns stations all over the country and has several stations in several cities in North Carolina, including Raleigh-Durham and including in Greensboro. Now, one thing of note, the book mentions a company called Clear Channel Radio. That's the old name for iHeartMedia. So don't confuse Clear Channel Radio when they're talking about a company with the concept of Clear Channel AM radio stations that we talked about in previous chapters. Now, we've talked about competition, we've talked about consolidation, and continuing in consolidation, there is another way to get around the ownership cap, and that is called the Lease Management Agreement, the LMA. It's an arrangement in which one station or group can control the programming, operations, and sales of another company's radio stations in a particular market. So, for example, Entercom might own a radio station in a particular market, but iHeartMedia are the ones that actually operate the station. And the lease marketing agreement between those two companies would allow for that to happen. Some pros and cons of consolidation. A pro would be that group ownership allows economies of scale. So you have more efficient programming, you have better news gathering because you can use the resources of people in various markets around the country. You can use people to produce content for several radio stations at the same time. So the clusters in Raleigh, for example, you have iHeart, where you have people that are doing jobs for several different radio stations. Same with Curtis Media Group, which owns 94.7 QDR. They also own Kix 102.9, Pulse FM, 96.1 BBB. So it's not unusual to hear the same types of creative services and production from one station to another, and people behind the scenes would also be working for the benefit of all those several radio stations. Now, a couple of cons to consolidation. Group owners wind up lacking sensitivity to community concerns. This is especially true of the more national group owners. There's been a lot of accusation that's gone against groups like iHeart and Beasley in that regard. Combining operations have caused stations to share resources. We've talked about this already. So it's a pro from the side of the executives of the radio station. It's a con for those that work for the radio station, where they may be asked to do more work for more radio stations than what they would have otherwise done. And that also means that the company is not hiring as many people. The third C, we've talked about competition, we've talked about consolidation. Now we're going to talk about control very briefly. Radio managers desire to gain more and more control of programming, promotions, and marketing of their stations. Part of the challenge here is that because you do have a lot of stations that are owned by these group owners, and you have formats that can tend to be pretty much the argument would be that they're kind of cookie cutter, so that the top 40 station in Raleigh sounds a lot like the top 40 station in Boston and sounds a lot like the top 40 station in Pittsburgh or in Chicago or wherever else, that you're not getting as much variety of content. There's not as much focus on the localism of the content in that particular city where the station is held, and because all of the decisions for the programming are being made on a regional or a national level by executives that may not very often, if ever at all, go into a particular city where a radio station is. And it takes away from that idea of programming something to appeal to a local audience in an area and meeting the needs of advertisers even as well. Because advertising tactics that work in New York and Los Angeles might not work in Raleigh. Now, let's talk about radio programming today. Most radio stations today cater to a fairly narrow market segment. We're talking about the core of listeners who prefer a certain type of programming. So as we talk about a little later on different formats of radio stations, they're all going to appeal to a different type of demographic. And even with that, those stations where they do have managers that are in more control of the actual content of the station and what sort of songs get played or don't played, what sort of talk show hosts get on the air and what they talk about and those sorts of things, you can even fine-tune that a little bit more to try to cater as much as you possibly can to your target demographic. So 2 key components to radio programming. First off, target audience. In developing their campaigns, advertisers try to identify this for their product and then develop appeals towards that group. So while at the same time the station is trying to appeal to a certain demographic, it is doing so in hopes that an advertiser will want to reach that same demographic. And companies are definitely looking at how well various radio stations are reaching the people that they, as the advertiser, want to reach out to as well. Station management tries to identify a target audience by its age, gender, music preferences, lifestyle, ethnicity comes into play. All sorts of other details are going to be folded into some of these decisions that are being made based on the information they have. And with all that information, they then develop a program strategy to satisfy the group that they're trying to reach out to. The program strategy is known as the radio station's format. So the format is really encompassing all of the different programming elements, the way that those programming elements are put together, the way that they sound. Is it a nice tight sound with audio overlapping audio that there's never any dead air? Sometimes on certain formats, that's not what you want to go for. Sometimes you want something nice and slow and chill, and sometimes you want a second of dead air. Sometimes you want content that's a little more highbrow. Sometimes, if you're reaching for a general audience, you want to keep things kind of simple. All of that comes into play when a radio station looks at putting together its particular format and really kind of impacting the station's overall sound. And that particular sound is going to appeal to different audiences in different ways. A successful radio station consistently delivers its intended target audience in both aggregate size, in other words, quantity in terms of numbers of people, also in lifestyle preferences or quality, looking at qualitative data of its listeners. What's the audience's attitudes, beliefs, values? What sort of things are they involved with? What sort of activities do they engage in? What sorts of products and services are the listeners most likely to be desiring? All those sorts of things would be lifestyle preference data that a radio station is going to be interested in and is going to try to put together in order to be able to have that for advertisers to appeal to them. Now, you can take a look at a couple of tables in your textbook for top radio formats by the number of stations and also by the number of listeners. Let's talk about news, talk, and sports formats. News and talk are on about 1,600 radio stations in the United States. Currently tops all other formats in terms of number of stations. More than half of all AM listening today is going to be the news, talk, and 2 sports stations. News talk attracts men ages 35 and older. Sports attracts men age 25 and older. And sports tends to do pretty well on AM. So does news talk, because the fidelity of the sound, the crispness, the clearness of the sound is not as important to the talk listener as it is to the music lover. Because for talk, mostly what the listener is going for is information. And it doesn't matter if it sounds a little crackly or if you have sounds that aren't necessarily in full stereo. It's more about engaging in conversation and listening to the conversation. Country music formats, over 1,600 stations here with 56 million listeners each week. This is one of the most widely popular music formats that is around on the radio. It attracts people aged 25 to 49, mostly white audiences, and country tends to deliver more women than men. Part of that has to do with the culture of how women are accepted in country music as a whole. Also, that country is tended to be seen as a more family-friendly sort of format. You can make arguments as to whether it is or not, but it's something that women are going to gravitate towards because of that reason, especially women that also happen to be mothers. Most country stations also serve as full-service operations. What we mean by full service is that it's a station that tends to have more of its content and more of its activities outside of content that tend to focus more on the local community. Announcers being involved in different community events. You have more opportunities for things like news and weather. Also, you have remote broadcasts that tend to happen quite a bit. All these things would be kind of within that full service sort of atmosphere. Country represents 15% of commercial radio stations in the United States. Another popular format, adult contemporary. And you have different segments of the adult contemporary format. You have what's called soft rock, about 700 stations there, and they'll carry monikers like light hits or mix. Hot AC, or hot adult contemporary, about 400 stations in the United States, tends to be a little more up-tempo, more of a rhythmic format many times as well. The oldies format tends to be soft music, not metallic sort of music, stuff from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Most stations don't refer to themselves as oldies much anymore. You'll hear the term classic hits more and more these days. As the era of what is considered to be oldies music tends to change as the years go along. When I was growing up, oldies was kind of that era between 55 and 75. But now you're even starting to see music from the 90s slip into these oldies and classic music stations. Announcers on these stations tend to be pleasant, friendly. They tend to be non-controversial as well. You're not going to hear a lot of political talk. You're not going to hear a lot of strong opinions on adult contemporary stations. They're more about the music and people enjoying the experience of listening. You also tend to have adult contemporary stations be played in a lot of workplaces, the listen at work sort of vibe. It is popular with women ages 25 to 64, and it's strong where it counts to many advertisers among middle and upper income housewives and with working women. And part of the reason for that is because in many family households, it's the women that make the primary decisions about how the family spends its money and where it spends its money. Now, the number of AC stations is declining a little bit due to increased popularity of news talk, Hispanic, and urban formatted stations. Nevertheless, it's still rather popular. Contemporary hit radio, CHR. You can lump top 40 into this category. These stations act like a jukebox. The emphasis is placed on the music that is leading the charts in record sales and downloads, also up-and-coming hits and recurrent hits. A lot of these types of stations will use a fast rotation sort of programming approach. It's a strategy in which songs are played again rather quickly, especially if you have a top 40 station where you are mainly playing only the stuff that is absolutely popular at that particular moment. That playlist is going to be really small, so you're going to hear the same songs over and over and over if you're listening to the station throughout the course of an entire day. Contemporary hit radio stations tend to sound busy. Everything is really tight with a lot of overlapping audio. It's going to be filled with commercials and contests and jingles and jokes, and every once in a while a hit song as well. And the listeners for these types of stations tend to range from pre-teen to young adult women. Hispanic radio becoming more and more popular as we see the growth of Hispanic populations in the United States. Mexican regional and Spanish contemporary are both hot formats in this genre. Besides the growth of the Hispanic population, also their economic clout is part of the factor for the growth of the number of Hispanic radio stations and the number of listeners. Also, the popularity of music crossing cultural lines. You don't necessarily have to be of Hispanic heritage to enjoy Hispanic music, and some folks may not even understand the language. They just like the flavor of the music, and they listen for that purpose. Some other formats, black and urban contemporary stations appeal to listeners under age 35 from all racial and ethnic backgrounds. Urban AC and urban oldies, they tend to skew older, with ages 35 to 54. And what's interesting is that in both the Raleigh-Durham and in the Fayetteville radio markets, the urban stations are the ones that are consistently ratings winners. They tend to buck the trend compared to what's happening in other markets, in that you do have more people listening to urban stations of one type or another than any other station in the market. Adult hits stations like Jack's and Bob's and stations that have other names like that. These stations focus on pop hits from the 70s to the 90s. They tend to have deep playlists and more obscure hits. So they're similar to oldies and classic hit types of stations, but they don't necessarily play just the most popular music from those eras. They will tend to play certain songs from certain albums that may not necessarily have been popular back in their day. Active rock, men outnumber women 3-1 in listening to this category. It is not a market leader, but its listeners tend to be very loyal, I should say. Those that really like this genre of music, this tends to be the only type of music that they will listen to, or just one of a few different types of formats, and it's going to be their go-to station if they have an active rock station in their market. Album-oriented rock, AOR. It's a subset of classic hits and active rock that's been developed as a core of informed, dedicated, loyal listeners. So it's almost kind of an intellectual approach to rock music. There's much more concentration on the artistry of the music, the way that different progressions are played within the music, knowing a lot more about the history of the artists and the bands and the songwriters. Some other formats that aren't as popular in a mass appeal, but all of these formats tend to have very loyal listeners because of the type of content that it has, kind of in the same way that the active rock audience is. Religion formats can be broken up into teaching and talk, contemporary Christian music, black gospel, southern gospel. These listeners are very loyal listeners. They will turn into their station and they will stay tuned in for a long, long time. A lot of that has to do with some of the principles that listeners to these types of stations carry with them, and they're looking for content that kind of meets the needs of their faith, as well as providing entertainment and information. Classical formats, 55 plus demographic by and large here, but you also have the college educated and the professional. Those that listen to classical music tend to have much more disposable income, so it attracts an advertising clientele for products and services that tend to be more pricey, more luxury sort of items. Jazz, you have a 35 and older demographic. It's a high-quality listener that, in the same ways as those that listen to classical, they truly love the fullness of the sound of the music and the quality of the audio. And both of these audiences also tend to be very knowledgeable about the music, about the artists or the composers, and some of the meanings behind the music, in terms of how it was written, why it was written, and all of that is very important to them. Non-commercial radio, three main types that we're going to talk about in this category. First off, community stations. These are licensed to civic groups, nonprofit foundations, local school boards, or religious organizations. These are going to be stations that truly are run by a community group, perhaps a 501c3, where for them it's about the passion of the content that they are providing. College radio, stations that are licensed to universities and secondary schools. CCCC has two of them. WUAW 88.3, broadcasting out of the Lillington campus, and WDCC 90.5, which is at the Lee campus. These stations tend to provide a musical mix, very eclectic most times, also tends to be a little more progressive, and they serve as training sites for students many times. Thirdly, you have public radio stations. These are stations that meet the requirements set by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to receive federal funding and programming from National Public Radio, of which in our area, WUNC would fit that bill. Almost 20 million people listen to NPR weekly. And one of the anomalies, as we talk about the Raleigh-Durham market, is that WUNC, as an NPR station, is one of the highest rated stations in the market, where it is very consistently in second or third place in the market, which is kind of an anomaly for NPR stations. They usually tend to rank rather lower in the ratings from market to market, but in Raleigh-Durham, they're one of the most important stations. Different public radio formats include these on your screen: news and talk, classical music in there at times. The AAA format, which is the adult album alternative format, tends to be more of kind of a lighter rock, acoustic rock. Sometimes you'll get some modern folk rock in there as well. Jazz music, also popular with public radio. And then you have low power FM stations, or LPFMs. These are stations that have power levels from anywhere from 10 to 100 watts. They usually broadcast to a small radius around its transmitter. We're talking somewhere in the range of 3 to 10 to maybe 15 miles around its tower. These stations are required by the FCC to be programmed for at least 36 hours per week in order for them to hold on to their license. Many of these low-power FMs tend to serve as repeater stations for small AM or FM stations. It's very popular with the AM stations in particular. You will hear a lot of stations that traditionally have been on AM talk about their FM simulcast. They tend to be on FM stations that fit this low power bill that allows you to have a crisper sound of their signal, but it's not going to broadcast to a very large area compared to many of the traditional FM stations that you hear. So, this is going to be a good point for us to take a break. And when we hop on to part B of the video, we are going to continue on and finish up the notes.